Since we're all kind of stuck inside, or at least we're supposed to be staying inside, I thought this would be a good time to do real crime story time with Jill. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about when I was a criminal defense attorney. I did almost all felonies, so it was like murder, rape, and robbery all the time. One of the more memorable cases I had was a murder case. My client's name was Donald, and Donald was accused of killing his cousin Boo by stabbing him in the chest one time. Now, the whole one-time thing, that kind of gives us a little bit of room in terms of intent to kill, because they have to show that. That's one of the things that the prosecution is required to show. But I thought we had a good self-defense because Boo was much bigger than Donald, and Boo was known by everybody in the neighborhood as a guy who had come back from Vietnam with some really serious problems. And his usual pattern was to steal money from his mother's purse early in the day. And then he would go and buy himself some cocaine, and he would smoke it. And then he would take all of his clothes off and run around the neighborhood. Now, sometimes he menaced people. So there was some record of the police having to come to take Boo away. But generally, because it was a fairly tightly knit neighborhood, generally people would just call Donald or call some other relative of Boo and say, okay, here's where he is. He's naked. He's high. Come get him. And usually that's how it would work out. The neighbors didn't want him to have to be locked up anyplace. But there was one occasion when he had frightened an older lady, and she called the police, and the police came and got him, and he was involuntarily committed to the VA hospital for a while. The person who had to sign the paperwork saying that Boo posed a threat, an imminent threat to himself or to others, was Donald, and Boo never forgave him for that. So every once in a while, when Boo would steal money from his mama's purse and go buy some cocaine and smoke the cocaine and take all his clothes off and start running around, he would announce that he was going to kill Donald. But usually he would just say it, and he might puff out his chest a little bit. But Donald was able to talk him down and take him home. Did I mention that this is like grown-up story time? So you might want to get yourself a beverage. I know I'm having some wine. So on this particular occasion, it was different from other times because this time Donald was just playing cards on the little boulevard right across the street from his house, minding his own business. And Boo came running up, naked, of course. And this time he picked up a great big gray cinder block and like held it up over his head and said he was going to smash Donald's head in. So Donald took it a little bit more seriously. And he couldn't seem to calm Boo down, and the guys that he was playing cards with couldn't seem to get Boo to calm down. So Donald said, look, I'm just going to leave for a minute. Now, once Donald was in the house, he could see his boys still sitting out there at the card table, and he could hear him laughing a little bit, and he probably thought they were laughing at him. His pride was hurt. So he got a steak knife in case he had to protect himself, and he went on back outside and went back to playing cards. And sure enough, a little while later, here comes Boo, and he's threatening to kill Donald again, only this time he's really clowning. He knocks the table over. He grabs Donald by the collar. I mean, he's really acting up this time. And then he gets that cinder block again. And when he comes at Donald, Donald stabbed him once in the chest, like right around the sternum. And that was enough for Boo to bleed out internally and die. So we kind of got a self-defense. And we got a good self-defense, but I want a great self-defense. Donald, from the paperwork that I've seen, doesn't have any priors, nothing. So I'm thinking that this really is something that is a very unusual event in his life. He's not likely to do anything like this ever again. He's not likely to be in that situation again. So I want a home run. I don't want like a stand-up triple kind of self-defense. I want a home run self-defense. So first thing I do is make copies of all the paperwork I got, and I go to the jail to see Donald and to give him his set of copies. So he'll have everything that I have, and we're going to keep on doing it like that as the whole process continues. Well, Donald is maybe 5'7". He might weigh like $135. He's a little guy. He's smaller than me. And one of the most striking features about him when I first meet him is his eyes are like really, really far apart from each other. He looks like prey. You know how squirrels have eyes on either side of their heads so that they can see something coming. You know, if the coyote is coming to eat it or a hawk is getting ready to come down, squirrel needs to be able to see. So that's why their eyes are far apart, or at least I think that's why. I don't know. But anyway, his eyes were really, really far apart. And another thing that I noticed about him right away was that he talked like he didn't want his lips to touch. We all know people talk like that. They talk like they don't want their lips to touch, and you can still make out what they're saying. But it was a little distracting for me, I got to admit. And a lot of times during the course of our first conversation, if he talked for a little while and I was listening to him, then the next time I started talking, I was talking like I didn't want my lips to touch. So it was a very interesting first contact. And by the way, it's not like on TV when you do a jail visit. On TV, there's somebody in the room, like a guard or a deputy or somebody standing off in the corner quietly. That's not what really happens because the conversation is privileged. You can't let anybody else just be there unless you're willing to give up privilege. So what they do, at least in Detroit, what they do is they lock the attorney in a small cell, a visiting cell. It's maybe like 6 by 8 feet. It's really small. And then somebody goes to get your client, the defendant, the person who's accused of whatever. They bring them back. They lock them in the cell with you, and then they leave. And you can hear the deputies down the hall watching Wheel of Fortune or whatever and talking and laughing. So if something bad happens, you got to get their attention. And it's really loud in there anyway. So you really have to struggle to get their attention to get them to come back. I never had to do that. Never because of a problem. But even when I was finished with a visit and I was ready to go, it was hard to get their attention. So it's not like it's on TV. So you got to carry yourself like you're not willing to put up with a whole lot of foolishness. Well, with Donald, that was easy because he was very timid. He looked like prey, and he was really upset about having killed Boo. So I explained to him what to expect. We got like the preliminary hearing, and there's going to be a bunch of pre-trials and scheduling conferences and stuff. So it could be maybe a year before we actually get to a jury trial. It's usually faster than that, but sometimes it's not. It all depends on whose docket we end up on, which judge we get. So first time we go to court, we're in the courtroom and we don't want to have the preliminary exam. We want to waive it because we don't want the prosecution to get a chance to have witnesses get up there and testify and preserve that testimony so that if a witness disappears or no longer wants to cooperate, they can't use their exam testimony at trial. Because at trial, they could have somebody read it to the jury and the jury could say, and I really wouldn't be able to cross-examine them because the person's not there. The cross-exam that I would do at the exam would just have to do. So we don't want to have the exam. We're going to waive the exam. And I asked Donald when they first brought him out to tell the judge that we were going to waive his exam and just have the case sent over to big boy court and set for trial. I asked him, do you see any family members in the courtroom? So he looked over his shoulder real quick and he said, oh yes, a whole bunch of them. My mom and them are all here. So we put everything on the record. We get a date for our first time in big boy court where he's going to be arraigned again. And as I'm walking out of the courtroom, I see a whole bunch of people with those light brown eyes like Donald got, and the eyes are all really far apart on opposite sides of their head. So I know that that's them. So I kind of motion for them to come on out in the hall with me. Well, we get out in the hall, and I've put my briefcase down. I'm getting ready to talk to them because I want them to understand procedurally what's happening. Because, most people have never been through this. So we get out in the hall, and somebody taps me on my shoulder, and I turn around, and there's a woman talking to me who is so strikingly unusual looking that it startled me. She got the far apart eyes. Her jaws didn't quite line up right. And there was a lot of like white stuff accumulated in the corners of her mouth while she was talking. And there were like those lines of spit that we sometimes get. But there were several. And she was really, really close to me. And it startled me. So I went, ah! And then I realized how rude that was. And that was ridiculous. And I could not think of a way to apologize well enough on the spot. So I told her, I'm sorry, I don't hear very well. You'll have to talk directly into this ear. Because quite honestly, I just didn't want to have to look at her anymore. And I knew that if I did look at her, it would be difficult to maintain eye contact because I'd be trying to check out all the other stuff that was going on. So I feigned a hearing problem and told her that she should talk directly into my left ear, that my right ear was just no good. So this meant that for the next 9 months, as we were getting ready for trial, every time a family member came to court with the mama and the mama started talking, whoever it was started talking, I would have to offer them my left ear. So my stupid lie kind of painted me into a corner. But at any rate, we talk, I explain what's going on, I explain what they should expect next. And then I ask them, is there anything that they can think of that Boo ever did that was so crazy that even a stranger would say, oh, well, you got to kill him. You can't, if he raises a cinder block up over your head, you got no choice. You got to kill him. You got to, or at least use deadly force to stop him. And that's really what our defense was. And all of these people who all talk like they didn't want their list to touch said, nah, everybody knew he crazy. He smoked that crack, steal from his mama, run around naked. So I asked them to please think it over. I gave out my business cards and said, look, if you think of anything that we think Donald would know, then let me know, because we can make that part of our defense. Even if he wasn't there, if he just heard that Boo had hit somebody else in the head with a cinder block, or that Boo had choked out somebody or something like that. If Donald had a reasonable belief when Boo came at him that day that Boo really was going to kill him, then Donald could use deadly force to defend himself. I mean, if the old lady down the street bakes you cookies and she's really nice to you and she's tiny and sweet, but then one day she walks up to you with nothing in her hands and says, today's the day. I'm going to kill you right now. You cannot shoot or stab that lady, because any belief that you might have that she really is going to do it, it's not a reasonable belief. Given the circumstances, your history, her size, the fact that you don't see anything in her hands that she could use to harm you, you can't use deadly force on that lady. But in this case, we got somebody with a history of erratic behavior, with a history of threatening my client, Donald. So maybe the family knows some details. So every time we got a pretrial, there's a whole passel of people, because this was an unusual family and they were kind of loud and they were just really kind of different. So it wasn't a group of relatives. This was a passel of kinfolk. But every time I would ask this passel of kinfolk, have you thought of anything unusual that Boo ever did? Something really, really crazy that even a stranger would think is scary. And even a stranger, I'm talking about a jury now, even a stranger on the jury would say to themselves, oh, well, Donald didn't have a choice. He had to kill him. He had to use deadly force to defend himself. And there was only one stab wound. That doesn't necessarily give the idea that there was intent to kill. He was just trying to stop him. That's what we want the jury to think. And I need some kind of information that might be helpful to get the jury to think this. This goes on for months. And every single time, this passel of kinfolk says, nah, I can't think of none. Everybody knew he was crazy. He'd steal from his mama, smoke that crack, run around naked. Everybody knew he was crazy. That's not the home run that I want. I'm still stuck with a stand-up triple when I want an out-of-the-ballpark home run to defend this man. So one day, we have a pretrial. We're getting close to trial. We have a pretrial. We might have another month, maybe 6 weeks before the trial date. But the trial date has been set. And afterwards, we're out in the hall, and I'm talking to the family again. I'm offering them that one ear because, again, I boxed myself in saying I couldn't hear well. And I ask them again, can anybody think of anything? I mean, just think back to something really, really violent or unusual that Boo might have done that would make even a stranger think you got to use deadly force when he comes at you. Well, there was this kid who was kind of standing at the back of the group, and he raises his hand like he's in school. And I'd never seen him before. So I said, yes. And this kid says, what about the time he ate up his own hand? And I said, what? You know, what about the time he ate up his own hand? Everybody know that. We all know that. And all these people are nodding their heads saying, yep, there was that time that he ate up his own hand. So I asked this kid to tell me the details, and he defers to his mama because she was intricately involved in that particular incident. And that incident resulted in an involuntary hospitalization as well. She tells me that a few years back, Boo did his usual act, stealing, smoking, running around naked. And somebody called the police that time. And when the police arrived, Boo was in a vacant lot. And there was a fence at the back of the lot. And he was close to the fence. He couldn't get around that fence. He was going to have to either try to climb it naked, or the police were actually going to get custody of him rather easily. So as the police are kind of closing in on him, and it's just two officers on foot, a man and a woman. As they close in, Boo turns to these officers and bites off the fleshy part of one of his hands, bites it off, and there's skin hanging and you can see tendons, and he starts chewing his own flesh. Well, this freaks out Detroit's finest, and they call for backup, and an ambulance arrives, some other officers arrive, and they're able to get Boo down on the ground, and they give him a shot of Ativan directly into his jugular because they need to get him under control right away. And he's hospitalized. So the woman tells me this, and this is exactly what I've been looking for. I mean, this is the kind of information that I need to be able to give the jury context about what Donald was facing that day. But then I asked him, I said, I've been asking y'all this for a long time to tell me something really, really bad or unusual or violent that Boo may have done that would make even a member of the jury or all of the members of the jury say, oh, well, you got to stab him or shoot him or something. You got to stop him somehow because he really will kill you. And they all shook their little heads and said, no, is that what you was talking about? Is that what you're talking about? Well, yeah, that's what I was talking about. But I couldn't really be mad at them because they're under duress. They've never been through anything like this before. I was so happy to call the prosecutor on the case. And we were friends. It's not like on TV where we hate each other and we don't associate with each other. Some jurisdictions are like that. When I practiced in the Bronx, it was definitely like that. And when I was nice to prosecutors, I actually got in trouble at my job for being nice to prosecutors. But in Detroit, at that time, you could be cool with somebody. You're going to fight like cats and dogs when you're in the courtroom. But that doesn't mean that it's personal. You don't like hate someone personally unless they do something dishonorable like cheat. And some people do. But me and this woman, we were real cool. So I called her and I said, I need to come in and talk to you because I have to see your face when I tell you about my defense. And she said, okay. So we set a day and time for me to come in and talk to her. But in the meantime, I wanted to find at least one of those two police officers who actually witnessed the self-cannibalization. So I called the 4th Precinct. I don't even think the 4th Precinct exists anymore because everything's changed so much. It's been like, 25, 30 years since this happened. I called the precinct and I explained why I'm calling. And it's such an unusual story that whoever answers the phone has heard something about this happening. And they actually put the female officer who was there on the phone with me. So I explained to her why I'm calling. And I try to refresh her memory about that incident. And before I can even finish trying to refresh her memory, she says, oh, yeah, I remember. So I explained to her that that man is now deceased, that he was killed, and that I believe he was trying to kill my client when he was killed. And I asked her if she remembers details and if she'd be willing to come to court to testify if I subpoena her, to make sure she gets her pay, her court pay. And she says, I ain't seen nothing like that before or since. That shit was crazy, and my partner never went back out on the street after that. Hell yeah, I will come in and tell whoever what I saw that day. So when I went to see the prosecutor, I told her that not only did I have some information that I'd gotten from a relative, but that I'd actually located the cop, and the cop was willing to come in and testify, and we ended up getting a deal for Donald so that he was placed on probation, manslaughter, something. But yeah, he got probation, and I think that was the right outcome. Thank you for joining me for Real Crime Story Time. I'm going to have to think of some more stories to tell. I think I've got some pretty good ideas because, as you can imagine, if you're doing criminal law in Detroit in the 90s, it's pretty eventful. Everybody take care. Wash your hands.